The subjunctive in English is a grammatical mood that expresses hypothetical situations and outcomes. It's the mood that expresses wishes, hopes, desires, and any other imagined outcome that can be described in writing or speech. It is not a verb tense, but a grammatical mood that discusses hypothetical ideas. Unlike many languages, the English subjunctive doesn't have a specific form. It is composed of sentences that express the mood using the base form of a verb in a finite clause. A finite clause is a phrase that contains a verb expressed in the past or present. In the context of the subjunctive, finite clauses deviate from others because the verb within them will remain in its base form rather than being conjugated. The base form of the verb is the basic infinitive form without the preposition to. This is the form that a verb will take in a subjunctive finite clause. For instance, the teacher suggested that we finish our work. The subject made a past action towards the other subject, making a finite clause in the subjunctive. Another example is, I ask that you listen to me. This phrase is subjunctive because I'm expressing a desire that hypothetically can happen. Just because I ask that you listen to me, it doesn't mean that you will, so the outcome is hypothetical. The subjunctive is one of the three grammatical moods, and it's not the only way that it differs. The indicative expresses facts, the imperative makes commands, but the subjunctive opens possibilities that hypothetically can be. Despite not knowing whether they'll happen, the fact that they can happen in an expression is what makes the subjunctive. All of these are grammatical moods, and a mood in any language is a grammatical category that classifies the action from the speaker's perspective. This means that a mood modifies the manner between subjects, so the expression of words may or may not happen in the reality of the speaker. When we say the teacher suggested that we finish our work, if the speaker suggested something, the outcome in the finite clause may or may not happen, so there is no certainty in the expression. I ask that you listen to me means that I ask for something that may or may not happen, so the finite clause is subjunctive. It's not the same as saying the teacher suggested finishing the work and I want to listen to you. In this case, both sentences are indicative because they state facts without any outside possibility. If the teacher suggested finishing the work, the action was already finished, so there are no hypothetical options. If I said, I want to listen to you, the action is only expressed by me, so it's indicative with no other possibilities. When compared to the subjunctive, there isn't a visual difference, but grammatically, they are in different moods. This concept is way more noticeable in other languages because they have visual conjugations. English, on the other hand, tends to keep a verb's base form in the subjunctive, which is why there is no visual difference. In my conditionals video, I mentioned that the subjunctive is based on conditional type 2, and this is where the mood tends to break grammar. Here's what I mean. The following phrase is subjunctive. If I were you, I would go to work. This phrase has an if clause with a past simple condition and a conditional result. But in the if clause, the subject I doesn't have the regular conjugation of to be, which is was. The sentence should be, if I was you, I would go to work. But English changes was to were, and the purpose behind it is to indicate that the situation I'm describing is unreal or improbable, from my perspective. If I were you, I would go to work. In the English subjunctive, was changes to were because it shows hypothetical outcomes and thus violates normal grammar. It indicates a scenario that is unreal and improbable, which is the core function of the subjunctive. Conditional type 2 represents unreal situations showing what could happen hypothetically, and that's the reason why the subjunctive is entirely based on this conditional. This is why it's very hard to understand because saying, if I were you, opens the possibilities of what could happen if I were you. By far, if I were you is the most common expression in the English subjunctive, and in my opinion, the best way to understand it is to use it in conversations and listen to the expression in context. In the subjunctive, were doesn't just apply to the subject I. It applies to all subjects because the word expresses uncertainty and hypothetical outcomes. If I were you, if you were me, if he were her, if she were him, if we were them, if they were us. In every expression, were shows a hypothetical outcome by connecting it to direct object pronouns, and from there, any possibility can be said. Even when the word doesn't fit grammatically, like I, he, and she, which should use was, were still expresses something hypothetical. Therefore, it's the subjunctive. In contrast, sentences that use was describe outcomes that are possible and likely to happen, as in, if I was here earlier, I would clean the room. This sentence is indicative because there is no other subject to whom something hypothetical can be expressed. Still, it's in conditional type 2, so was is always used in the indicative, expressing something possible that can happen. To show a better difference, it's also possible to write the sentence with the corresponding subjects that fit was, like he and she. Now, in comparison to the subjunctive, there is a visual difference, especially when connected to direct object pronouns. This is what makes the subjunctive, but it's also important to mention that not all subjunctive sentences follow this structure. Nonetheless, English separates the subjunctive into two tenses, the past and present. The past subjunctive refers to the mood that describes outcomes you wish were true. This kind of sentence uses were to establish the hypothetical, which is mainly used with an if clause in conditional type 2, but there are other structures. Some examples are, I wish I were taller. If she were rich, she would buy a house. If we were them, we would have fun. This is the function of the past subjunctive, which uses were in every expression. The present subjunctive is what I showed in the beginning, where a finite clause has a verb in its base form. The present subjunctive utilizes a verb's infinitive to discuss a present or a future hypothetical outcome. One example is, the coach recommended that he stop playing soccer. In the subjunctive sentence, you would think to use stops, hence it's the conjugation that fits the subject he. But we have to use the verb's base form, which is stop. And although it sounds weird, it's the rule for the English subjunctive. This is the function of the present subjunctive. Additionally, the past subjunctive utilizes a verb's base form in a finite clause even if the verb is irregular. It's important to note that when a finite clause involves the verb to be, it almost always uses were. But sometimes it can use the base form of be, which is why it's irregular. For instance, he will join the group on the condition that he be the leader. Because the phrase displays a condition, be stays in its base form. Ultimately, this is how the subjunctive functions, but to fully understand its basis, it's extremely crucial to analyze the difference between was and were. The distinction between the two is by far the most useful way to practically understand how the subjunctive functions in writing and speech. When should we use was and were? In the past simple, to be is conjugated to was for I, he, and she, and were for you, we, and they. This is true if we're talking about possible outcomes that are likely to happen. This means that the conjugations of to be in the past simple are indicative and express facts. Some examples are, I was 8 years old. You were there. He was in school. She was at work. We were young. They were happy. Other examples in a conditional if clause are, if I was wrong, I would admit it. If he was lying, I would know. These if clauses understandably use was in the indicative because they express real conditions. However, the rules change for if clauses that are subjunctive. When using to be in an if clause that expresses an unreal condition, which is conditional type 2, we always use were no matter what the subject is. If I were you, I would buy a new car. If you were me, you would not leave. If he were her, he would stay. If she were him, she would talk. If we were them, we would try something. If they were us, they would do anything. All of the sentences are subjunctive because they express improbable outcomes that are not facts. They are hypothetical possibilities, which is why they use were. This is the distinction between when to use was and were. When using to be with an if clause in real conditions, like events that already happened or are likely to happen, we use the regular conjugations of to be, like was for I, he, and she, and were for you, we, and they. But when using to be with an if clause in improbable conditions, like hypothetical events that have not happened, we always use were, no matter what the subject is. This is the complete function of the English subjunctive. So was and were is the most practical concept to try and understand the mood in writing and speech. In case you need more explanation, I put 2 links in the description that will lead you to useful sites that further explain the subjunctive mood and the difference between was and were. Overall, this is how the subjunctive mood fully operates in English.